Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cornell. I'm Anna Heller, the Bruce A. Beal Director here, and I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I also want to ask you, before I get to introduce tonight's speaker, if you enjoy our events, please remember to fill out the feedback forms on your chairs. They're important to us to know what you think and what you enjoy. Also, if you aren't already, I would ask you to consider becoming members of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum. It is our members who help us offer all these exciting programs completely free of charge. So I want to thank you for that. Now, I always enjoy introducing our very accomplished speakers, but today it gives me greater pleasure still to introduce one of ours, our very own Dr. Robert Vander Poppen, who's an associate professor in the Art and Art History department here at Rollins College, and also the vice president of the faculty of the College of Liberal Arts. And he just told me, I hadn't realized this, that he'd never given a formal lecture at the Cornell before. So it's a first for all of us and for him. Dr. Vander Poppen has a PhD in archaeology, classical archaeology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his research explores the material correlates of Roman imperialism with a special focus in the region of ancient Tuscany and the pre-Roman culture of the Etruscans. His most recent two articles actually appeared in the journal Etruscan Studies and articulated the relationship of power between a hilltop sanctuary, Etruscan hilltop sanctuary, and its dependent hinterland. Professor Vander Poppen has excavated for over a decade at various sites in Italy, in central Italy, with Southern Methodist University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, among others. And he is currently working on a long-term project analyzing a series of burial monuments from the Archaic period in the territory around Fiesole, which is basically a suburb of Florence. And this work will appear as a chapter in an edited volume entitled Fiesole. So tonight, Dr. Vander Poppen will share the research that he has done on the sarcophagus that you all saw on your way in, which is currently in the entrance gallery here. And we are so lucky that he spent some of his sabbatical time a couple of years ago doing research on this object, which is on very long-term loan, hopefully more than long-term loan to the museum. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Vander Poppen.
As Dr. Heller said, this is a first for me, getting the opportunity to do a formal talk in the museum. So I'm as excited as a kid going to kindergarten tonight. That said, none of this would be possible without the generous donation of the White family of the sarcophagus on long-term loan, and also the pioneering work on the sarcophagus that was done by Dr. Fred White of the Appleton Museum. So I want to thank both of them for their prior work, as well as for the ability to have this piece in the Cornell Fine Arts Museum so that we get a chance to look at it tonight. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about the sarcophagus. Dr. Fred White established a few things about the sarcophagus in his initial study of the piece, which was published in 2015 in the International Journal of Archaeology. And so this will set as a baseline for us for what we know about the sarcophagus and how we can think about some of the larger issues that we'll deal with tonight. So the first thing that we know is, due to a chemical provenience study conducted by Dr. White, we know that the marble is in fact from the ancient section of the Carrara quarry in Luni, Italy. This is up and near the modern area towards Pisa. We also know that the same workshop produced another sarcophagus that was found at Ostia, a sarcophagus that contained the body of Matilia Acti. Her husband was a priest named Euhodus, and from the inscription, we can tell that sarcophagus was produced from AD 160 to 170. So that gives us a nice chronological range for the sarcophagus here. on internal evidence that I won't go into tonight, but that Dr. White covers in his article, we can give a precise date of between 165 and 180. There are indicators in the style here that reflect developments that were taking place during the plague of Galen, where from 165 to 180, there was a massive diminution in quality amongst public art at the level of the elite, but not in the level of imperial art. And our sarcophagus suffers from some of those artistic and stylistic deficiencies, which would suggest a date of between 165 and 180. All right, so that's our baseline for this evening. Let's move on and let's talk about early Rome. So in our discussion tonight, we're going to be looking at the intersection of myth with historical developments and with intellectual culture. And so I refresh all of our memory for those of us who don't intimately daily associate with the details of the foundation of Rome the way that I get to as a privilege of having my job. So for those of you guys who have forgotten, Rome is founded by a pair of twins, the twins Romulus and Remus, according to legend. Their mother was a Vestal priestess who was ravaged, according to the stories, by Mars. And the two children were set in a basket, put adrift in the Tiber, and the basket came to rest at a bend in the Tiber where they were rescued by a wolf. And that wolf suckled the twins, kept the twins safe until the royal shepherd, a man named Faustulus, recovered the twins from the river and raised them in this spot down by the Tiber. Once that occurred, Romulus and Remus grew up, eventually restored their grandfather to his kingdom at a local city, and then decided to found the city of Rome. Once they decided to found the city of Rome, they put some things on their to-do list, at least Romulus did. I mean, if we had Romulus's to-do list up here, it would include things like observe omens, get the blessing of the gods, build wall, and then fourth on his to-do list would be kill brother in bloody fratricide. So Romulus had a full to-do list on day one for the city of Rome. But Romulus faced a problem. The big problem that Romulus had was one of demographics. Romulus had a city that didn't have any people. And so, as a result, Romulus was forced, according to the legend, with the necessity of bringing people into the city of Rome, initiating a process of incorporation, which I believe is key to the interpretation of our sarcophagus. So, Romulus decided to invent a body of Romans. Romanness was not defined as an ethnic marker. It wasn't defined on being born at Rome. It was defined on an assimilation to the Roman project. His plan was to develop an altar dedicated to the god ASYLUM. We get our word asylum from this god. And it was a place of refuge where individuals from the community could arrive and they could come to the altar and they could start a new life. That new life allowed them, whether free or slave, to obtain citizenship in Rome and to become a full member of the community. For Romulus's purposes, this worked wonderfully in terms of building an armory. Lots of folks showed up who were of military age and who could help advance the military project of the state of Rome in its early days. Maybe you're already noting the demographic issue here. So, over time, the demographic issue presented itself. There were few women in the city of Rome. And as the historian Livy says, Rome revealed itself as a city destined to be great for a single generation alone. Romulus decided that as a result of this deficiency, it was time to go and do some glad-handing, to press the flesh and try and create some alliances with the neighboring cities. He sent out a delegation to all the neighboring cities. And everywhere his delegation was met with a lack of success. No one would grant the Romans the right of connubium, the right of formal intermarriage. And so Romulus decided to take matter into his own hands. I've got a lot of text on these slides. I hate it when people read me text that's on slides that I can read myself. So you'll notice tonight that I'm going to summarize, paraphrase. If you want the Livy, if you want the original from Dionysius of Halicarnassus or from Plutarch, it's up there. You guys can read it as I'm chatting. So Romulus's plan was to advertise a festival and invite all of the neighboring communities into the city of Rome to see its buildings, to see its temples, to see its walls, to get an experience of the new city, to advertise what had been going on in the new community. He claimed that he had found an altar to a new god, a god named Consus, that had been miraculously uncovered from the mud of the Tiber, buried in the area that would later become the Circus Maximus. And he invited all of the neighboring families to come and participate in a ceremony that would have games associated with it. This is an ideological story not only for Rome's women, but also for the introduction of chariot races at Rome for the first time as well. This festival tied with the Circus Maximus in that way. So, at a given moment, Romulus had planned to solve his demographic crisis. The Romans sprung up when Romulus folded his cloak, and they abducted the daughters, the unmarried daughters, of those in attendance, of all the neighboring families, spiriting them away and encouraging the families to leave safely, to head out of the city of Rome. And most of those families, flabbergasted by the transgression, not imagining that anyone would dare to violate Zeus's, in this case Jupiter's, hospitality in this way, left dumbfounded and didn't return for a period of a couple of years. I'll let that sink in. All right, so Rome seemingly has solved its demographic crisis. And our sarcophagus would seem to depict that abduction moment. In fact, the moment of the abduction is the most common representation in any point of the plot associated with the narrative of the abduction of the Sabines. And you can see elements of abduction here in the Sabine sarcophagus. You can see figures engaged in a push and pull. I'll note this pair here, where we have a Roman soldier carrying a Sabine woman and moving her out and away from the ceremony that's taking place. Another Sabine woman is trying to run away as a soldier here, a particularly eager fellow, has two Sabine women in his clutches. Presumably he's got a buddy that also needs a wife. So there are elements of the abduction that are encapsulated here within the imagery. Now, let's put this in context. Let's look at rape or abduction as a metaphor for death. This is a common metaphor that's used in the ancient world in terms of sarcophagi. And the way that it plays out is like this. It plays out most prominently not in scenes of the abduction of the Sabines, but in scenes associated with Proserpina's abduction by Pluto. And so you can see a sarcophagus here from Vienna that shows that scene. We've got here the chariot of Pluto, Pluto himself in the chariot, bent slightly backwards. We've got Proserpina, the daughter of Demeter, the Roman Ceres. She is shown here, kneeling, and something that makes my heart really excited. In the 2nd century AD, on the far end of our sarcophagus, we have a series of figures from the underworld that take on the iconography of Etruscan death demons. So death demons from the pre-Roman native Italian culture of central Italy, setting an underworld context for the scene. So when scholars discuss these scenes, they discuss them using the metaphor of abduction as death. And so it works kind of like this. Death, literally Pluto, shows up unexpectedly, out of the blue. We're told that Proserpina is picking flowers when she's abducted. The deceased, and you've already made the connection, right? The deceased is identified with Proserpina here. The deceased is abducted and carried off to the underworld, where the deceased becomes the unwilling bride of death in the underworld. And the family left behind then adopts the role of the longing Ceres who mourns after her daughter. This is the Greek etiology or Greek origin of winter, right? Persephone is down in the underworld. She eats 3 pomegranate seeds, and as a result, she has to return to the underworld for 3 months. Demeter, Ceres, is so upset that she doesn't do her job for 3 months of the year, and we get winter as a result. No fertility in the land. So this is the metaphor of abduction as death, generally speaking, when we see it in Roman art. Let's take a look at how that maps onto the abduction of the Sabines. If we take a look at our sarcophagus, we'll notice that it maps particularly badly. It maps particularly badly in terms of its thematics. And so the traditional interpretation of this sarcophagus as embodying that metaphor falls apart when we look at the iconography and when we untangle the meaning. Okay, admittedly, the Romans carry away the Sabines unexpectedly. That's part of the whole plot. But the Sabines are carried off to Rome, and Rome would seem to be a far cry to a Roman citizen commissioning the sarcophagus as a link to the underworld, right? Also problematic, the Sabines then, according to the analogy, would be becoming brides to death who would be embodied by the Romans. Again, a bit of an odd extension of the metaphor. And the family left behind then would be there to mourn as the Sabines did. But again, that's a peculiar bit of analogy because of the delay that the Sabines take in coming back to rescue their daughters. Is this a statement about a lack of mourning in the immediate aftermath of a funeral? That seems absurd. And so the traditional interpretation of the sarcophagus as tying into these themes of abduction as death starts to crumble. And we need a new explanation for what's going on in terms of the imagery of the Sabine sarcophagus. What I propose is that we place it within its historical context, and we look for similar images in order to find parallels and in order to help explain what we see in the imagery on our sarcophagus. One key element that, this is my spoiler, I want you to notice, there are children here. How do we interpret these children? I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So, let's take a look at the most famous parallel of this image from antiquity. We'll take a look at the image from the inside of the Basilica AEMILIA. When we hear basilica, one of the tendencies is that we initially think church, right, because of its later association with church architecture. For the Romans, basilicas were secular buildings. They were buildings that served a dual function of a law court as well as an economic or shopping space. The Basilica AEMILIA was a prominent basilica on the Forum Romanum, the main commercial, political, and religious space within the Roman state. And in its interior, the architects chose to place in a continuous frieze above the columns that separated the nave from the side aisles a scene of the abduction of the Sabines, which you see up on the top register here. And I want you to notice that our artists of the sarcophagus are quoting this scene. They were clearly familiar with it. Look at our pair here. That pair there is reflected in our pair that we see on the sarcophagus. I want you to note a couple of things. She lays back in the arms of the soldier. Her arm extends downwards and away from the body. Same motif here. Her other hand comes around the head of the soldier. Again, coming around the head of the soldier here. And so we've got a direct quotation of the Basilica AEMILIA. But the Basilica AEMILIA still doesn't help us to interpret what's going on with the children here. So I think that that is the wrong place to look in terms of figuring out what the intended message was, what the intended scene is, and what the intended content is for our sarcophagus. So we've got to go elsewhere. We've got essentially three major influences, three times when the Mediterranean world wrestles with Rome's origins. It does so the first time that Rome begins to expand, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries, as Greeks and Romans alike try to build a mythology that inserts the Romans into the Homeric tradition. Greeks had a hard time wrestling with the fact that folks that didn't have Bronze Age antecedents, that weren't part of the artistic tradition, that weren't part of the mythological realm, had come in and had conquered them. And so a series of myths were developed to insert Romans into Greek mythology in the 3rd and 2nd centuries. There's another consideration, another period of image making that occurs in the late Republic and early Empire under the Emperor Augustus. Think Virgil, think the Aeneid here. Those are the potent images that we're talking about. Yet, for Virgil, and for the school that Maecenas, Augustus's chief of staff, built around the emperor, the abduction of the Sabines wasn't a motif that was on their mind. So our third period of examination, our third period of interest in the Roman past, comes during the 2nd century AD, in a period that we call the Second Sophistic Movement. And I'll get to what the Second Sophistic Movement is in a moment. But it was a period that was characterized by Greeks once again attempting to systematize their role within the Roman Empire and the Romans' position vis-a-vis their power throughout the Mediterranean. What I propose to do then is to take a look at that latter period, the period of the Second Sophistic, conveniently the period in which our sarcophagus was manufactured, and to look at the intellectual concerns of the era to see if those can provide us with a key to deciphering the imagery in the sarcophagus. All right, everybody on board for our next step through the excursus? Awesome. So I'm going to take us back, and I'm going to lay a bit of historical background for what we're going to consider. We'll fill in Rome's interaction with Greece throughout the late Republic and get us up to speed in the cultural transformations that had taken place in the Greek East leading up to the Second Sophistic. So, Rome first began to engage with Greece largely as a result of its contacts through Sicily. In the 3rd century BC, the Romans famously sacked the city of Syracuse, the general Marcellus, and Marcellus's sack of Syracuse was a cultural turning point in Rome. Thousands of statues were brought back from Syracuse into central Italy, and the Romans began their ambivalent fascination with Greek culture. I'll get to that in a minute. Things went downhill from there. The Romans got drawn into a series of conflicts in the eastern Mediterranean, in Greece proper. From 200 to 197, the Romans engaged in what's called the Second Macedonian War against Philip V, called in by the city-states of Greece proper to attempt to liberate them from the Macedonians. That period ended in a bit of tension and nervousness, as when the Romans helped to liberate Greece, nobody knew whether the Romans would actually leave or not. This is one of the problems in inviting the Romans to a dinner party, right? Is you never know whether they're going to overstay their welcome. The Romans did leave. The general Flamininus at the Isthmian Games, a pan-Hellenic set of games that all Greek cities sent representatives to, at those games, Flamininus declared the freedom of Greece, declared Rome's intention to back away from the Greek world and to let Greece govern itself. Greece was incapable of doing so, and finally, in 168, Rome began to establish a pattern of direct rule. You'll notice that the Greek city-states were unable to keep Macedon out of their business, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus was drawn into the Greek East in order to once again push back the menace of Macedon. He successfully did so at a battle at Pydna. You can see Pydna here. And this was followed on quickly by the sack of Corinth in 147. The sack of Corinth was followed by an event in 133 that still boggles the minds of scholars. The last king of Pergamon willed his kingdom to the Senate and people of Rome. Just decided, I see the writing on the wall, let's get in on this from the ground floor, and said, I have no successor, the best successor for my kingdom are the Roman people. And so willed his kingdom to Rome. Rome is now inextricably involved in the Eastern Mediterranean and inextricably exposed to every facet of Greek culture. A last final gasp of Greco-Roman conflict occurred in 87 and 86 when the Roman general Sulla sacked Athens. So this created a bit of a Roman ambivalence towards Greek culture. There's a difficult relationship between Rome and the Greeks that characterizes the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. And there are two camps intellectually in Rome. One camp that was for embracing the variety of Greek culture that existed and adopting it as if it were Rome's own. This group, referred to as the Scipionic Circle, collected Greek art, read Greek literature, and emulated it in their own writings. They loved Greek theater. They read Greek theater. They attended Greek theatrical performances, and they were consumers and practitioners of Greek philosophy. Now, opposing them was a camp that took a very different view of Greek culture. It was a camp defined particularly by a statesman named Cato the Elder, and it was a camp that adhered to the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors in ancient Rome. And they rejected Greek education and Greek literary style. Why would you need that fluffiness in your oratory if your oratory is good on its merits? They also rejected Greek's fascination with the arts, because the arts were dangerous. If one spent one's time looking at art or attending the theater or, heaven forbid, learning Greek philosophy, you might become the kind of Greek that the Romans had just defeated on the battlefield. So, instead, they emphasized traditional Roman values such as piety to the gods, to family, and to the Roman state. And this wrapped itself up in military service, as well as an attitude that valorized agriculture as the economic basis of the Roman world. I've got a reconstruction of a theater here on this side of my slide, and the reason that I have that there is because of its date. Rome's first permanent theater was built in 59 BC. Other theaters are built in the Italian peninsula 200 years earlier. Rome feared Greek culture so much that it delayed adopting it until the 1st century BC. All right, so we have an ambivalent relationship in Rome with a camp that strongly opposes developments of the Greek world. And things would seem to be set up on a razor's edge of tension between Greeks and Romans within the Roman Empire. Is that a fair assessment? All right. Enter the Second Sophistic movement. 200 years after Rome had successfully incorporated Greece into its empire, Greeks began to engage in a cultural renaissance of looking at their own traditions, particularly traditions associated with literature and philosophy, in an attempt to explain and understand their place in this new Roman Empire. I say new tongue-in-cheek. Right? We're 200 years in at this point. So the Second Sophistic is essentially a way to conceptualize Greece's place in the Roman world. And the Second Sophistic and Greek culture in general got a significant boost from the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138, was a PHILHELLENIC emperor who was in love with all things Greek. He was so in love with all things Greek that he departed from the standard clean-shaven style of Roman portraiture and began to wear a philosopher's beard and adopted the curly hair of the philosopher-style portrait. Along with that came an invigoration of Greek arts, architectural forms, and imperial patronage by Hadrian in Greek cities. Hadrian builds a forum as well as a library at Athens, re-engaging Athens in the traditions that had made it a power in the Mediterranean. What the emperor does matters. And Greek culture became sanitized and became acceptable in the Roman world to a way that it had not been with Hadrian's ascension to the throne. So, what does that look like? I'll give you some samples of what was going on in the Second Sophistic. Some of you probably know the philosopher Dio Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed, also known as Dio of Prusa, after his hometown. Dio was concerned, as were his contemporaries of the Second Sophistic, as to what the political role of Greece was within the Empire of Rome. And he delivered a series of orations to local cities in Greece, counseling them on how to best exploit their new position in a way that would maximize Greece's power and influence in decision-making within Rome. And so he was concerned with a number of things. One of the things that he was concerned about was that Greeks didn't engage in empty competition with other cities, that they bought wholly into the project that was Rome instead of the petty rivalries between them. He talks about legitimate rivalries between Athens and Sparta that Rome laughs at, and then says, how much more must they laugh at the rivalries that we have between our cities today when they don't matter in terms of empire. He also asked Greeks to think not about local politics, but to think about the region, the province, and the empire, and to think about how their actions on a local scale could impact their standing and perception amongst those holding power in Italy. And so in a conversation that he had with the Nicomedeans over their rivalry with the Nicaeans, he said, you guys have to stop this. You can't compete over who has the nicest harbor, who has the best gift from the emperor. You have to worry about injustice, you have to worry about broader interests, and you have to think like a citizen of the empire rather than a citizen of Nicomedia or Nicaea. All right, so this is a taste of the Second Sophistic. A number of Greeks were able to navigate the Second Sophistic with stunning success. I give but one example. HEROIDES Atticus. When I was an undergrad, I had a professor who described HEROIDES Atticus as the Austin Powers of the Second Sophistic, international man of mystery, and I think that's a fantastic label. HEROIDES Atticus has the best Greek resume that you can imagine. He claims descent from Theseus, the legendary king of Athens. That's a pretty good claim, right? This is equivalent to Augustus's claim of having Aeneas as an ancestor. So where do things go from there? He was a member of Athenian family, but managed to achieve success both locally and within the wider Roman Empire. He was elected as archon for Athens in 140. He was appointed by the emperor in 120, and this is Hadrian. He's appointed by Hadrian as the prefect, the overseer of all of the free Greek cities. A number of Greek cities have been declared free by Hadrian. In other words, they weren't bound to the provincial government, but answered directly to Rome, and he was put as the official in charge of those cities. In addition, he managed to become the tutor of the sons of Antoninus Pius. Remember our Antonine plague from a little while ago that we talked about? Same dynasty of emperors. And Marcus Aurelius is the reigning emperor when that plague occurs. You'll note that he's here. Beyond that, he was actually able to marry into the imperial family, marrying the cousin of the current empress. This is a pretty good gig if you can get it, right? And as a result, he achieved the position of consul ordinarius. In other words, he was actually elected consul by the assembly at Rome, and he was the first Greek to have done so. And beyond this political success, he also was an active patron of the arts throughout the empire. No less than 11 major public projects were constructed on his funding and at his direction throughout the Roman Empire, both east and west, both Italy and Greece. And so this is the example of the successful outcomes of aristocrats within the Second Sophistic. This is what you could do if you thought in new ways about how Greece fit into the narrative of Rome. All right, so let's go back to our Sabine sarcophagus. I know I've shifted gears here a minute. Now we'll get back to what all of you guys came here for. So let's go back to our myth. If the image of the abduction doesn't really fit what we see on the Sabine sarcophagus, we have to look for another point in the myth to decode what's happening in the imagery. And so let's move forward to the next stage. After the Sabine women had been abducted, I mentioned that the family stayed away for a couple of years. Eventually, the families decided to come back. One town, Kynina, they get less grief than the other families. They came back to attempt to recover their daughters in the same year that they were abducted. Things didn't go too well. Romulus defeated their king, stripped him of his armor on the battlefield, and dedicated that armor in a brand new temple to a god named Jupiter Feretrius up on the Capitoline. The other towns waited those few years, and under the leadership of Cures, which you see here, and its leader Titus Tatius, came to Rome and engaged in a military attempt to recover their daughters. You may know this story. This is Tarpeia. Tarpeia is the daughter of the chief of the garrison on the Capitoline Hill. She makes a deal with the Sabines to let them onto the Tarpeian Hill. The Romans punish her by throwing her off the hill eventually. And as a result, capital punishment in Rome continues to be a toss from the Tarpeian Hill moving forward. As I guess recompense, the hill gets named after her. But not a good outcome. All right, so the situation where we're at is that the Sabines hold the capital, Rome's most fortifiable hilltop. They're in possession of the most impregnable fortress in all of the city of Rome, and they're advancing from favorable ground with the ground to aid them down into the Forum and attacking the Roman troops, who are losing badly. At that point, Romulus knows that he's in trouble. And so Romulus does what Roman generals would do for centuries later. According to the legend, Romulus, falling back with his troops, drops to one knee and addresses Jupiter and says to Jupiter, "Things are going kind of badly here. Don't forget about us. I will give you a temple if you turn this battle around." This is a very Roman thing to do. Roman religion was very contractual. It was a votive religion. In other words, it was a religion where you asked the gods for something, you promised something in exchange, and the Romans really had a good gig in this because you didn't actually have to deliver to the god unless the god answered your prayer. Needless to say, Jupiter did answer his prayer, Jupiter Stator, Jupiter the Stayer, and on the spot where he made that prayer, he later built a temple to Jupiter Stator, which is currently one of the most confusing puzzles in Roman topography. It's an unsolvable riddle as to where this thing actually was. But I'm going to suggest we know at least one place where it is in a moment. If you look at the very left-hand end of our sarcophagus, you'll notice that there's a temple there. You can see it here in the background, the pediment up top, and you'll notice that it has a porch on the front. And if we count out the columns, and there's one actually buried right here as well, if you count out the columns, you'll notice that it's a tetrastyle temple. It has 4 columns across the front. It's an Italo-Etruscan temple. It's one that's frontally oriented along the lines of archaic tradition in Rome. In other words, it's a temple that's rooted within the tradition of the time period. It's meant to look archaic. None of those newfangled Greek inventions in architecture have been incorporated in it, besides maybe those Ionic columns that are up here. So I believe that we have a different moment depicted here. We've got the moment immediately following Romulus's vow. So what does that constitute? In an act of heroism and reconciliation, what the Romans called concordia, the daughters of the Sabines plunged between the lines that contained their fathers and their husbands and begged them to sign a truce. They begged them to stop their fighting. They begged them, for the sake of their sons and grandsons, not to shed blood that would incur blood guilt between family members. And they addressed the Romans and the Sabines as engaging in an act of parricide. The Romans and the Sabines listened to their daughters and wives and signed a treaty. The Sabine peoples from Cures were transferred en masse into the city of Rome, and Tatius, along with Romulus, set up a dual monarchy in the city of Rome. What about those children on our sarcophagus? If you'll notice, we have Roman soldiers, but all of our males aren't Roman soldiers. A number of our males are bearded adult males. The beard indicating non-Roman status and the beard indicating age. In addition, many of our women are not in the act of being abducted. On the left-hand side of the sarcophagus, the women are in a very different pose, a pose of supplication, a pose that in the iconography of the Romans and the Greeks before them meant begging for something, asking for something, entreating for something. I believe we have a Sabine daughter here on her knee, reaching up towards her husband, entreating her husband specifically to make peace with her father, who stands in the back holding the hand of his grandson, who presumably he's just met for the first time. Which means that if this is the temple of Jupiter Stator, and this moment is in fact the moment at the reconciliation, we may have on our sarcophagus one of the very earliest, one of the very few representations of Romulus in ancient Roman art. Because our soldier here in front of the temple would become Romulus, the woman on her knee would become HERSILLA, who Plutarch, who wrote a life of Romulus during the Second Sophistic, focused on as being the author of this compromise. And we would have Romulus's son, Aurelius, the founder of the Avilian family of later Roman fame, depicted behind. All right, so that's a reinterpretation of the imagery. Why does that reinterpretation of the imagery work with the Second Sophistic? Let's go back to our scene. Politicians of the Second Sophistic were engaged in a process where they were thinking about incorporation into the Roman Empire. They were thinking about the role of conquered peoples in directing Roman policy. And they were thinking about the imperial projects that the Antonine dynasty was engaged in terms of expansion. Marcus Aurelius builds a gigantic column in Rome commemorating his victory over the Germans. The Romans were engaged during the period of production of this sarcophagus in their own period of expansion. And so, folks in the intellectual elite in Rome during the 2nd century were thinking about how they fit into a Roman Empire that was expanding and incorporating new peoples. How do we read the sarcophagus then? If that's the case, we read the sarcophagus as a monument that focuses on these children, which are the different element of the scene from other contemporary representations of the Sabines, because those children are future Romans, derived from non-Romans, in the same position as the intellectual members of the Second Sophistic. In other words, they're standing in a place where they will begin to take on the shared responsibility of governing the Roman Empire, in the same way that Greeks of the Second Sophistic were conceptualizing their own relationship to Rome. This becomes a monument then about forced incorporation and the potentialities for those that are drawn into the Roman Empire, whether of their will or against it. Thank you, guys. Questions? Yeah.
Hi, so this is kind of one of those questions that's probably difficult to answer, but why would that have been an appropriate choice for a sarcophagus? What would make one of these members of the elite want to represent that on their funeral monument?
That's a fantastic question, actually. This is something that I've been wrestling with, but I don't have a firm answer on at this point. One of the things that crosses my mind in terms of this is that these sarcophagus being sarcophagi for the elites, that this may be an individual who's involved at the highest levels, either in policy or on the ground with Rome's current expansion into Germania. So somebody that's engaged actively in forced incorporation into the Roman Empire. And maybe we're seeing an anxiety, right, over the violence and the guilt and the blood that comes along with incorporation. There are elements of this in Antoninus Pius's column, Marcus Aurelius's column, where he begins to show the real brutality of Roman expansion in a way that, say, Trajan's column does not. Trajan's column is sympathetic to the Romans. Marcus Aurelius's column is sympathetic to the Germans. Yeah. Yes?
Have you traced how did it get to North America?
Yes. So it winds up getting bought by the William Randolph Hearst family. The Hearst family goes bankrupt. It goes into receivership as part of the estate from the state of California, and then eventually it's purchased by the family of Ashley White in Ocala, and then it winds up in the Cornell Fine Arts Museum.
So the Hearst got it in, what, 1890?
A little bit later than that. We believe that it's excavated in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and the Hearsts pick it up in the 1920s.
So prior to that, it was in position? Where was it?
We don't know anything about the circumstances of its excavation other than its excavator, as far as I can tell.
And would this have been a single sarcophagus? Was it in temple at some point?
Fantastic question. So the way that Roman burial works is that there are taboos on burial within the city. The pomerium, the sacred boundary of a Roman city, necessitates that all burials take place outside of a Roman city. So streets leading in and out of Roman cities, and I'm gonna play on my audience here. How many of you guys have been to Pompeii? Has anybody been to Pompeii? Yeah. As you walk down the streets between Pompeii and the Villa of the Mysteries, you walk through the necropolis, lined on each side by all of those burial monuments. These sarcophagi were set in niches in those burial monuments. So if you'll notice on the sides of our sarcophagus, there are two very thinly sculpted scenes, very thin relief there. Those are only meant to be seen in passing as a glance because they sit back in a family tomb so that you can only see the frontal relief. They weren't on view. They were enclosed behind walls, sometimes with little courtyards. Other times, Roman burial monuments are fully architectural in that they're a small mausoleum of sorts that you have to make your way through the door into an interior space in order to see the sarcophagus. Yes?
I was wondering about the identification of Romulus. Was there anything in the way he's depicted that's different from the other Roman soldiers, or is it just the temple behind it?
It's the temple, and it's Plutarch's close association of those events temporally. For him, they come bang, bang. Immediately after Romulus vows the temple to Jupiter Stator, that's when the Sabine women intervene. And so my tenuous connection there is on the basis of the fact that he's so closely associated with that architectural space that in the text, and it's there in the Livian tradition too, but it's more prominently in the Plutarchian tradition that those two events are so closely associated with each other that I think the stronger identification is that figure is HERSILLA, Romulus's wife, engaging in that space, and that's an easier link than Romulus is. But I sure like that as the identification of Romulus there. Yes?
Would this have been painted, and if so, have traces been determined like the color?
So as far as I can tell, there aren't any traces of paint left. We know that a lot of Roman sculpture had paint on it. Liverani started this trend of looking at the coloration of ancient Roman and Greek sculpture. And if you've seen any of the publications, this stuff looks totally garish, right? It's in brilliant colors, like somebody vomited a rainbow onto the side of a temple, right? And it ruins all of our sort of notions of the austereness of white marble. What I think Liverani is doing there is he's looking at those pigments, and he's looking at the pigments in their immediately out of the can coloration. These things weathered. And so all of those garish images you've seen of the recoloration of the Parthenon, the recoloration of all of these other things, tone those down by a factor of 10, right? These become much more muted. Now, we do have other Roman sarcophagi that have evidence of paint. There's a long tradition in Etruria, in central Italy, of painted sarcophagi as well. So very well, this may have once had paint on it. We know that ours was reused at some point as a basin in a garden. There are holes in the corner of it. So there's some rough usage on that sarcophagus at some point that would have stripped all that paint away. Yes?
How does this depiction of Romulus compare with any other depiction of Romulus?
That's a great question. We have very few of them. Where we do have them, the most famous examples on the Archaeopagos. He shows up on Augustus's altar of Augustan Peace. And on Augustus's altar of Augustan Peace, it's a very different iconography. That said, our soldiers here are all depicted not as soldiers. They're all depicted, let me rephrase that. They're depicted not as archaic period soldiers. They're all depicted in the contemporary soldiering costume of the Antonine era. So he takes on Antonine iconography as opposed to attempting to reflect the iconography of earlier periods here, if it's Romulus. Yeah. Yes?
Who would have decided in the family that this was going to be the depiction on the sarcophagus?
That's the million-dollar question. Some of these are commissioned ahead of time. Families were actually making this determination. In Roman society, the paterfamilias, the oldest male relative, has a lot of decision-making power. Probably would have been that individual. However, we also know that sculptural workshops were producing these to have on the shelf for the event of an unexpected death. There are some spectacular ones where one particular motif, an Endymion sarcophagus, where the goddess Selene approaches Endymion, that sarcophagus is a sarcophagus for a deceased male, right? The divinity is coming down, embracing the male, taking them off in order to become a divinity. The equivalent myth, iconographically, is Ariadne, being approached by Bacchus. And we have an example of an Endymion sarcophagus that was really quickly re-chiseled in order to be an Ariadne, right? There's an unexpected death. The shop doesn't have what's needed. They quick make some alterations. Endymion gets a sex change, and all of a sudden, we've got a sarcophagus that fits. So there are both custom-made sarcophagi and sarcophagi that seem to have been sitting around in these major workshops ready for purchase. Yeah. Yes?
I want to go back to what you said about Romulus being on the Archaeology. Where on the Archaeology?
He's on.
Is it the processional? Or?
He's not in the processional. It's a very different Romulus, right? It's one of the twins in the Tellus scene.
Okay.
So he shows up as the infant. Yeah.
So as a child.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Are you not surprised that this is in such good condition? Do you have it here?
Yes. There was this magical moment when Dr. Heller and I drove up to Ocala, and Ashley White pulled the face off the container. And I nearly had a heart attack when I saw the sarcophagus for the first time, just because of the quality of the relief, because of the quality of the restoration, just absolutely gorgeous in terms of its preservation. That said, the workmanship on the sarcophagus is not as nice as some of the other sarcophagi from the 2nd century that fall out of that era of the Antonine Plague. There's a non finito quality to it. Some of you guys know that term from Michelangelo's Prisoners, right? The unfinished nature to it. What seems to have happened is that there was so much death during the Antonine Plague that workshops could not keep up with the final finishing process on sarcophagi during that 15-year period, and our sarcophagus doesn't have the kind of polish that you see in other sarcophagi immediately before or after it, and that continues on in imperial monuments through the plague. So although it is in really good shape, the finish on it isn't the same quality as some of the other sarcophagi that we have from immediately before or after. Yeah.
So you talked about the scene here with the child.
Yes.
And non-Roman, and there's another child there. Is that,
Yes.
Is there a story being told?
So if there is a story, it's one that mythologically I haven't been able to identify yet. But it's not just this child, right? There's another child here that's being held, in this case, by a figure that I'm having a really hard time dealing with iconographically, right? It doesn't fit the pattern of the abducted women. It doesn't really fit the pattern that we have for the fathers. The figure doesn't really fit the pattern for the soldiers. I think the figure falls closest into that pattern of the abducted women, right? In terms of the haircut here. The swags of drapery are similar in some cases. Do we have a mother who's restraining her child from going and meeting its grandfather or rushing to its father on the battlefield? I'm not quite sure what to make of that child yet. And this middle scene seems either to be an invention of the artist or seems to follow a version of the story that we don't have. Or at
Is
least
that
that I'm
child
not
being
familiar.
picked up, held up?
This child here?
This, yeah, the second one, or down low?
This child here. Now, so the mother is reaching down and clasping the hand of the child as her husband is picking her up. And so I think she's a bridging figure that links the abduction. Remember, this is the figure that's quoted from the Basilica AEMILIA. She creates an intellectual bridge visually to the outcome of that abduction. If we look at the Basilica AEMILIA one, there's no child there. Her hand is empty. Yeah.
Is there any treatment provided in literature of how Romulus met his death, and who was he succeeded
Yes.
by?
Romulus is succeeded by a king named Numa Pompilius. He's a Sabine who lives outside Rome. Rome's monarchy is an elected monarchy, so the senators all get together and elect the next king, and that individual then becomes an absolute monarch for life. How does Romulus die? There is a thunderstorm, and after the thunderstorm, Romulus has vanished. And Livy, I love the Roman historian Livy because he'll tell you both the mythological explanation, but then he'll give you his sort of hard, critical historian take. And so Livy uses a Latin phrase. He says, duplex fama inde. After this, there are two stories. And the first story is that Romulus was swept up in the thunderstorm by Jupiter to become the Roman god Quirinus. Augustus really liked this image of Romulus, right? Because then he could link it to Caesar's own apotheosis, his adopted dad. The other story, Livy's more critical story, is that he says there was a thunderstorm, and when the rain was sleeting sideways, basically, the senators tore Romulus apart and hid pieces of them in each of their garments, and then walked away so that no body was left.
Is there any earlier iconography besides the Basilica Aemilia that might have been borrowed here,
We don't have,
related to the same Emily?
that's not related to the Sabine.
Figures and stuff from in there.
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Eliminating the bespoke sarcophagus, was there a general set of themes that were used?
Yes. So they fall into a number of categories. One category are these mythological themes. The theme of Alcestis was a really popular one because of its associations with the underworld. As we've mentioned before, the abduction of Proserpina was a really common one. The Meleager myth was very common. In addition, figures that have liaisons with divinities, Rhea Silvia and Mars, Endymion and Selene, Ariadne and Bacchus, those tend to be the most frequent mythological sarcophagi that we have. There are a series of figural sarcophagi that represent more than mythological scenes. They represent basically garlands. They represent architectural frames. These were the ones that were of the highest quality because of that narrative work that occurs on the front of them. Yeah. Yes?
In the Egyptian, the life story of the individual, the family, achievements is usually as part of the monument. The Romans didn't do that.
The Romans did that through inscriptions. So where the inscriptions are usually placed on the lid as opposed to on the sarcophagus itself, although there are examples where they're on the sarcophagus. And the Romans detailed what they called their cursus honorum, their list of offices there. We have a few that come to us from a family tomb of the Scipios. And these are spectacular. One of them is a really sort of rustic, archaic Latin that says things like, by my birth I made my ancestors proud. I ennobled my family through my virtue. I came to the rescue of the state. All of these very sort of mos maiorum themes. So even when Romans are tapping into this Greek tradition in terms of imagery, they're very much representing their lives and their achievements in a way that bespeaks what Cato would have been proud of, that patriotism, that piety to family, and that honoring of the ancestors through one's actions.
So in this period of time, we weren't fortunate
There would have been a top to this sarcophagus. We don't have any indication as to whether the lid was with it when it was excavated, or whether the lid was missing from it when it was excavated. What we can say is that the clamps for the lid are there. The lids are often clamped on using a metal so that the lids don't move. And we've got the metal clamps for the setting of the lid in the top of the sarcophagus. So it was lidded. We don't have the lid or any evidence about it. Yeah.
Did you say earlier that it showed there was some use for like a garden?
Yeah, at one point it's reused. And this tends to be a phenomenon of the late Renaissance and Baroque period, that these get reused. They get, oftentimes they get touched up, and they're put out in spaces like formal Renaissance gardens where water flows through them, and they actually create a fountain out of these. Yeah. There's another example in the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh that has a similar set of drains put into the end of it as well. And the Matilia acti sarcophagus, the one made by the same workshop, was at one time in its life used as a garden implement as well. Yeah. If you've got a Renaissance garden, right, you want an ancient sarcophagus in it. I mean, this is your claim to fame, certainly. Yeah.
Do you ever worry about whether you might contract some sort of a bacteria, or virus, or plague?
Not from a sarcophagus. There are stories of archaeologists working in latrines in areas where you get permafrost and really hard winters, where folks have come down with bacterial stuff. But that's, we don't have to carry curse insurance or anything like that. I say tongue in cheek, right? It can be a concern, but it's not a major concern. Yeah, it's more active in the excavation process than it is in terms of dealing with monuments. Great. Thank you.